we're going to be talking about the intergenerational nature of the Saturn Uranus cycle. And if you don't know what any of those words are, don't worry. I hope that this workshop is accessible to people at all levels of their astrological practice. I'm going to start this talk today with a story. And this is a fictional story that I've made up, but it very well could be true, or you may relate to aspects of it. And I start with a story because astrology itself is a system that's deeply entrenched in mythology. And the myths that we have in different time periods and different cultures in our world inform the roots of these cultures themselves, and as well as the continued experience of what those cultures go through. And so I think of the way in which our lives are woven by the stories that we hear and tell ourselves repeatedly. So this story will be relevant to what we're talking about today, but for now you can just kind of like listen and put it somewhere in your mind, and then we'll come back to it later. Our earliest known documentation of astrology also involves a rich tapestry of myths about the gods and deities, seen as the planetary bodies that held court over our fates. So we're going to begin this talk with a kind of story and then work back from that theme. Our story begins with a woman named Gail, who is an incredibly powerful and successful woman. But Gail longs for companionship and to start a family of her own. Gail joins a dating app and meets Yuri, who seems to share her values and to want the same things that she wants. Gail and Yuri get married after not too long, and Yuri seems to be completely unique from people that Gail has dated in the past. So their honeymoon phase is spontaneous, full of surprises, with never a dull moment. And they soon begin to have children, and this is where Gail begins to see changes appearing in Yuri. He starts to become more distant. His cruelty comes out. He starts to show signs of abuse, both towards Gail and their children. Gail does her best to protect the children, but has become trapped in the marriage at this point, losing much of the strength and independence that she was once known for. After several years and several children, Yuri comes to believe that his children are the source of all his suffering and is sick of the burden of parenthood. Gail wakes up one morning to discover that he has voluntarily set in motion a series of events that places the children in foster care. They are gone from their home. Powerless and distraught, Gail spends years trying to retrieve her children from the system, but is unable to reverse the decision that has been made. Meanwhile, Yuri takes full ownership of the home and estate, leaving Gail at his mercy and with no constructive legacy for their children. As the children get a little older, Gail pleads with them to voluntarily return home and reclaim their space. They refuse because they fear their father's anger and abusive behavior. Only one son agrees, Samuel. Samuel has grown angry and vengeful during his many difficult years in the foster care system, and he wants a way to get back at his father, as well as a chance to take back some of his rightful inheritance. Samuel returns to the family home as a teenager, and a terrible fight breaks out between him and his father, Yuri. They struggle, and in a moment of self-defense and an effort to end the suffering once and for all, Samuel pushes his father down the stairs and injures him badly. Believing this to be a justified kind of revenge, Samuel then moves himself into the family home. After several more years, Samuel meets a woman named Rhiannon and falls in love. Swearing that he is going to be different from his father, he marries Rhiannon and they start their own family. But as their children start to be born, Samuel is overcome by childhood triggers from the cruelty that he suffered, and he begins to enact similar abuse on his own children despite his best efforts. Threatened by their joy, intelligence, and creativity, Samuel exerts total control over their lives, rarely allowing them to leave the house, stifling their life force, and restricting as much of their existence as he can. Devastated but unable to break this cycle after several children, his wife Rhiannon finds herself pregnant again and decides to go stay with relatives until the baby is born. She doesn't tell Samuel what is happening, and the baby, who she then names Julian, is born in secret and sent to be raised by these relatives away from the cruel domain of Samuel. Julian, raised with more love and understanding than his siblings were ever able to have, returns many years later to expose the violent and horrific abuse of his father upon his siblings, bringing his father to accountability for his actions and showing his mother and siblings another way forward and a path of healing. So you can let that story just sit for now and sort of simmer in the back of your mind, but we will come back to some of the themes as we continue talking. One thing that may have been evident to you in that story is what I would call intergenerational trauma, which is to say trauma that is affecting more than one generation in the family. Samuel swears that his adult and parenting is going to be different from that of his father, Uri, but in the end is unable to do any of it differently because of what was passed down to him as a child. Julian, on the other hand, is able to find a different path, but only because he was able to grow up outside of the cruel control of his father, Samuel. So I consider this to be a story of intergenerational trauma. But we might also say it's a story of intergenerational healing, as the opportunity afforded to Julian by his mother, Rhiannon, allows him to find a different way and to return and call for a kind of accountability that may inevitably lead to healing in the family. So what is intergenerational trauma? First, it might be good to start with a definition of what trauma is. If you look up just a kind of like generic dictionary definition of trauma, it's defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And then physical trauma is sort of separately defined as a physical injury itself. But in general, when at least for the purpose of this lecture, I'm mostly referring to emotional, psychological, maybe spiritual trauma, which is that deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So intergenerational trauma, therefore, is deeply distressing or disturbing experiences that continue to affect different generations, even when the event that caused the disturbance itself has ceased to take place. So it's something that can become passed down intergenerationally. So the effect of the distressing event continues just as strongly when the event itself is no longer happening, and can continue through younger generations who themselves have not actually experienced the event firsthand. So we know now that when fetuses and children are exposed to adverse effects of their parents' trauma, the children themselves grapple with similar post-traumatic effects, even if they have not directly experienced the event of the trauma. We see them struggling with something that came through their parents' experience, but the effect of it may be felt just as strongly in the children. Epigeneticists in the last 30, 40 years or so have focused a lot on post-Holocaust research and have found that PTSD can be clearly traced through at least 2 generations following the survivors of the Holocaust themselves. And I suspect that as this research continues, they will see the link continuing to echo through future generations as well. It's really just that we are only maybe 3, maybe 4 generations after the Holocaust, depending on how old the survivors were. These epigeneticists have also been able to make clear links in how DNA itself changes to adapt to conditions such as war and persecution. For instance, and this is just one example, the epigeneticists have found that a person who experiences starvation under extreme conditions may undergo a spontaneous DNA adaptation that allows them to be able to subsist on reduced levels of nutrition. So their DNA actually changes to adapt to the experience of starvation. Then these people have children, and the children of these survivors are born with the DNA adaptation as if their body is born already adjusted to be able to subsist on lower amounts of nutrition, without the context and the circumstance itself that that adaptation came through. And so they've seen a lot of, in this particular example, instances of digestive issues and other intestinal distress in the children of people who have experienced starvation. And that's just one example of how this might work. Hereditary conditions are another potential example of how these intergenerational themes work. And there's a lot of studies that are being done around this and what hereditary conditions actually are and how it is that they're passed down in this generational way. So in intergenerational work of any kind, we can see that any shifts or changes made in one generation will inevitably affect generations that come after. And this happens specifically in family systems because there's that genetic component, but it can also happen in a larger social or cultural way as well. There are many indigenous cultures that speak about the 15th generation, which recognizes that each person is connected to 7 generations that have come before them, as well as 7 generations that are yet to come after them. And so that makes each of us this kind of 15th generation in the middle of 7 generations before and 7 generations after us. And I think that this applies to traumatic effects, but applies equally to the effect of healing and regulation as well, which is also something that can be passed on generationally. So this means that each generation picks up where the other has left off. And this is why extreme trauma like war or genocide can often take several generations to begin to heal, because each one is continuing a piece that adds to the foundation of previous ones. So we know that the planets themselves have cycles, and the most obvious one that we experience is the moon cycle, because the relationship between the sun and the moon from the perspective of planet Earth is very visible on the Earth because we actually see the moon changing shape. So we might know something about planetary cycles. But like the planets, generational trauma and healing has its own kind of cycle. There may be this growth and dissipating as well that happens in these generational themes. So if this is what we know about intergenerational cycles, what do we know about planetary cycles? We know that the nature of any planetary cycle, and when I say planetary cycles, in this instance, I'm talking about the relationship between any 2 planets from the perspective of planet Earth, which is really what astrology is. So of course, today we're talking about Saturn and Uranus, which is one particular planetary cycle, but we could really pick any 2 planets and look at some of the themes in their unique cycle. So the nature of every planetary cycle is determined by the unique characteristics, speed, orbit, temperament, and place in the Chaldean order of each of the planets, as well as the cultural myths and stories around those planets, beings, deities, whatever perspective you hold of them. So what if, for the purpose of this discussion today, we consider human relationships to be the same as these cycles, especially family relationships? What if human relationships and the cycles of humanity mirror the relationships and cycles of the planets? Is this not something that's at the heart of astrology itself? We can see cycles of trauma that run through the human experience, and we can also see cycles of healing, just as we may witness the opening or the waxing of a planetary cycle and then the waning or the dissipating of it as well. These can be seen on the individual level, but also on the larger collective level. And perhaps human trauma and healing mirrors that expansion or contraction that we see in the planetary cycles. Just like the planets and how their temperaments and orders shape the nature of the cycle between them, the human cycles depend upon the characteristics, background, temperament, and generation of the individuals involved. So the story that I just told is a fictional story about how intergenerational trauma works in a family. The limitations of one generation will transfer to the next, and the cycle will continue until there is some kind of change or disruption. So now let's talk about a different kind of cycle. So I'm going to give both a traditional and a more modern overview of the planets that we're talking about today as much as possible. So we'll start with Saturn because it's the faster moving planet. In traditional astrology, as many of you may already know, Saturn was known as the limit of the solar system. We thought that the solar system ended there, and before telescopes were invented, this was the furthest moving planet that we could see with the naked eye, and so it was considered to be the last planet in the solar system. Saturn in traditional astrology is cold, dry, constricting, destructive, and often a source of punishment, grief, sorrow, and hardship. It's also known to give authority, property, abundance, and power when it's in good condition, or continued chronic misfortune when it's in poor condition, especially if we're looking at an individual who has a night chart where it would be the malefic out of sect, or if Saturn happens to have poor dignity in the chart that we're looking at. In modern psychological astrology, Saturn represents structure, commitment, limitation, boundaries, wisdom, the passage of time, hard-earned rewards, consolidation, depression, sadness, endings. So there's, of course, a lot of crossover between these delineations, and many of the differences between the two, in my opinion, lie in the different beliefs around fate from the two eras that we're looking at, and how much an individual might be able to affect the circumstances of the birth chart or the transiting planets. And so in modern time, the idea of fate is a lot more relevant than it may have been during some of the more traditional astrological periods. And so there's this idea that something like punishment and hardship can be turned into hard-earned wisdom because we have the choice or the free will to be able to work with it. I'm not really offering an opinion one way or the other. They're just different perspectives on the way that that might work. And we know that Saturn also has a 29.5-year orbit around the sun. Then when we get to 1781, suddenly Uranus was discovered and Saturn was no longer the limit of the solar system. The discovery of Uranus shattered our understanding of the ecosystem we live in and was this uncovering moment of revelation, like, oh my God, things are not as we thought they were. And this whole system that's been around already for thousands of years is suddenly different. There's another planet that's in existence in our solar system. So, of course, there are no traditional delineations of Uranus because it wasn't one of the traditional planets. It wasn't known about when traditional astrology was in the works. But it is part of the traditional mythology that was present during the Hellenistic, medieval, and Renaissance periods as Uranus. And the shock of its discovery is in keeping with the themes that it has come to take on, such as shattering, uncovering, revelation. It can also bring breakthrough, rebellion, revolution, disruption, inspiration, change, transformation, anxiety, awakening, shock, and unexpected surprises. And we know also that Uranus has an 84-year orbit around the sun. So already in looking at what we might imagine to be the relationship between these two planets and what their cycle might mean as a result of that, we know that Saturn provides the limit and Uranus disrupts it, just as it goes with our knowledge of the two planets. The Saturn-Uranus cycle itself is 45 years, which means that every 45 years they appear to meet in the sky from the perspective of planet Earth. Although, of course, Uranus is incredibly faint without a telescope. It's possible to see it, but it's really hard to do without a telescope. And so, as many of you might know, 2021 was a year where they were squaring each other, and particularly in the waning square of their cycle. So let's have a look now at where we're at in that cycle. And just before I keep plowing along, are there any questions that have come up so far? Someone's mentioning Gabor Mate, yeah.
Yeah, this is great. I was just going to say, I mean, you're so thorough. I understand that why there are no questions so far. So yeah, people saying that's wonderful. I loved that you started with a story. I just wanted to let you know, and also honoring the land that you were on, I think was wonderful. And yeah, I don't think there are any questions right now.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
Questions continue to be questions, comments, concerns, all welcome as we go. Okay, so moving on. As I mentioned, the moon cycle is probably the easiest way to understand planetary cycles if this is maybe a new thing that you're looking at. And I have no idea what the different levels of astrological practice are in the people that are in this, but I'm going to assume that maybe planetary cycles might be a new thing. So I'll give a brief kind of crash course in how that works, just in case. And even if this is something that you do every day, it can always be nice just to talk about a little bit more. So we see in the moon cycle, again, something that is about the relationship between the moon and the sun from the perspective of planet Earth. So the moon itself does not actually produce the light that we see. The moon is reflecting the light of the sun. And so when we have a full moon, it's that the moon is able to reflect the most light from the sun in its cycle. And it's a beautiful symbolism to hold the moon cycle when we're looking at other planetary cycles, because we know that during the new moon, we don't see the moon at all. And it's the time when the sun and the moon are together in the sky. And then we know that as they start to separate from the perspective of Earth, we start to see more and more and more light on the moon until we have a waxing square, and then we have the opposition, which is the moment where the moon has the most light visible, and then it starts to wane into the waning square, and then the balsamic moon, and then we get back to the new moon itself. So we can really do this with any two planets, and what we're looking at today is like a projection of the moon cycle onto Saturn and Uranus, because they have their own cycle in the sky. If we had telescopes, we would be able to track that a little more clearly, and we'd be able to see, okay, Saturn and Uranus have been squaring each other. When it's a certain time of night, we can actually see the kind of 90-degree angle between Saturn and Uranus, theoretically, if you have a telescope and you're able to see that. And we have been able to see Saturn in the night sky in a really beautiful way. And especially over the last year, it's been so close to Jupiter, and chef's kiss, just beautiful. Okay, so let's go through the different stages of the cycle as it relates to Saturn and Uranus. The conjunction is when the two planets are together or aligned in the sky. And the conjunction is the seed of something new that's been planted in the ground, but hasn't yet grown into something visible. Just like on the new moon, where we don't actually see the moon, it's just the seed of something that's going to grow into visibility. So it's a birth of sorts, where we wait for the baby to grow and show us who it's going to be in the world. For shorter cycles like the moon, it only takes a few days for that growth to start to become visible. But longer cycles like the Saturn-Uranus cycle, it may take a few years after a conjunction to start to see what's really going to cook from that cycle. So the last Saturn-Uranus conjunction that we had was in 1988, from 27 to 29 degrees of Sagittarius. Although it's worth mentioning that they were still within 1 degree of each other when they both moved into Capricorn. So there are some people born in this year who have a Saturn-Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius, and then there are some people who have the conjunction at 0 degrees or 1 degree of Capricorn as well. And then the faster moving planet keeps moving, and eventually it separates enough for us to get to what's called the waxing square, which is the first square of the cycle. And I consider the waxing square to have a kind of activist energy. It's like a first call to something. It has gained enough strength and presence from the conjunction to know what it's fighting for. And it's working to bring something to light or fullness. It's working in that waxing way. Something is being catalyzed through friction as the planets separate from their conjunction. The waxing square in this cycle took place in 1999 and 2000. And the planets were also in Taurus and Aquarius, although they were reversed at the time. So we had Saturn in Taurus and Uranus in Aquarius then. And because the faster moving planet is always moving ahead in the zodiac, the slower moving planet is going to be the overcoming planet first. So for those of you who practice Hellenistic astrology, even though Uranus is not one of the traditional 7 planets, we can see that it is overcoming in this square because the faster moving planet is separating from it first. And then we get to the opposition, which is a culmination. The opposition is the full height of achievement and possibility for this cycle, for better or for worse. It's kind of like the most we're going to get out of it in a way. As you can see, the opposition spans as much space in the sky as it possibly can. It's in fullness. And again, thinking about the moon cycle is a really beautiful way to kind of synthesize the way that it spatially spans the sky, because the moon rises at the exact time that the sun is setting. And so they're truly opposite one another. They're spanning as much room in the sky as they can. So it's both the first and the last moment that we can see the possibility of this particular cycle fully manifest. And it's usually a kind of collective or shared experience as well. And so for this Saturn Uranus cycle that we're in, the opposition was in 2009, 2010 in Virgo and Pisces. And I like thinking about the dates that have already passed, because if you haven't yet done this, it's really fascinating to go back and look at what was happening in your life at those times. So if you were alive in 1988, you would start then what was happening during the conjunction, what was happening during the waxing square in 1999, what's going on in 2009, the opposition, and then of course, obviously, whatever was happening in the last year is probably a little more fresh in the brain. And then we come to the waning square. And it's worth mentioning also that as I'm doing these cycles today, I'm just looking at the conjunction squares and opposition. But some people like to look at the sextiles and trines as well. I just find that they're less dramatic. So like it's less interesting to talk about in a lecture. But if you're doing your own research with it, that could be really interesting to look for too. So the waning square is the 3/4 mark of the cycle, and it's about dissemination. I think about waning squares as a kind of last call for something, like, okay, this is your last opportunity to address something that's relevant to the cycle that you're most of the way through now. So it's about taking what we've witnessed during the opposition and being sure that we actually make use of it, wielding knowledge as power with a kind of responsibility. This also means that we restructure things and put them in their place, knowing that the cycle is changing and going to close soon. Is there anything from this cycle that still is left and needs to be seen? Are there resources and information that have come to light, especially during the opposition, that have not yet been properly dispersed, put to use, or integrated? What still needs to be done before rest can be taken? Perhaps this 3/4 mark also gets to the deepest sediment layers, which are not the first to be uncovered in the earlier stages of the cycle when something is still new. So like the moon phases, the waxing square and opposition may at times be more active or external, whereas the waning square or conjunction might produce more internal events or feel slightly quieter than the opposition itself. So we found ourselves in the waning square of the Saturn Uranus cycle throughout the 2021 calendar year. And as you can see, the faster moving planet keeps moving. And so now Saturn is overcoming in the square between them. And we had Saturn in Aquarius and Uranus and Taurus all through this year as they were squaring each other. And the particular stages of those squares were exact in February, June, and then the last one was right around Christmas. So we're still kind of in the last square. They're still only within 3 degrees of each other, but they're separating, and December was the last time that they'll square each other in this particular cycle. And the next conjunction that they'll get to, so when they start a new cycle or get back to that kind of new moon phase, will be in the year 2032 at 28 degrees of Gemini, and the cycle will start over. So what does it mean to be in this final square, or to be exiting this year where we've had this final square between them? In traditional astrology, we know that a square generally represents hardship, although it can offer resources and solutions by planets sharing a quadruplicity and being able to see each other. Excuse me. The square might lean towards difficulty, however, if it involves a malefic, which we know is Saturn. Although because Saturn is in Aquarius, it's currently well placed in its domicile and as one of the triplicity rulers for air. And in modern psychological astrology, a square can also be a kind of hardship, but may offer more of a stepping stone, a growing edge, or some challenge that must be integrated before moving forward. And just a quick little pause. Are there any questions? Looks like not yet. Just want to double check.
No questions as of now.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So I'd like to also introduce the notion of disruption with a square, particularly a square in this cycle. When we think of disruption itself, it's something that can be both traumatizing as well as healing. So for the sake of this talk, there's no value judgment assigned to it. I'm not saying that disruption is an inherently good or bad thing. I'm talking about it as a kind of force. So disruption by nature interrupts a cycle, narrative, or pattern that's already taking place and introduces an alternative narrative or cycle. And I love the image of the square that we have here for a disruption. This is the shape that the planets form in the sky. It's like taking a point that we have and finding new direction for it, disrupting the harmony or whatever is stuck. So what happens when we disrupt a harmful cycle in the interest of creating a more holistic narrative towards healing? Is that not what intergenerational work is? So this means that the first and third quarter marks of any cycle with the planets are the greatest opportunities for disruption. Squares can disrupt and dysregulate, whereas a conjunction will merge and harmonize, and an opposition will culminate and reveal. But all three of these aspects will bring about some kind of effective change or result, given that the planets can see each other or are blended in the case of the conjunction. And of course, again, the same for a trine and a sextile, but for the sake of time, we're not going through those in this lecture. So that means that now is our opportunity to understand our places in the larger intergenerational cycles that we are responsible for, and how we can disrupt them in the interest of healing and in the direction of healing, using the Uranian presence of disruption in service to healing and catharsis, and using the persistence, power, and authority of Saturn in service to seeing it through and holding to our responsibilities. So now I'm going to tell you another story, and one that most of you probably already know, which is the story about Uranus and Saturn. The story actually starts with Gaia, who is sort of bored and wants something to do, something to entertain her. She's ready for something different in her life. So Gaia decides to create Uranus for herself as a husband. But it turns out that he's not all he was cracked up to be in her imagination, and Uranus is kind of erratic and unpredictable. It's not really what she was going for. They have children, and this kind of continues between them. And eventually Uranus decides to hide his children in Tartarus, where they can't see the light. Tartarus is this sort of like Middle Earth place. And so he just kind of tucks his children away there. Gaia is totally sick of his antics and also craves the return of her children. And at the same time, she's unable in that situation to do much about Uranus herself. And so she decides to try to get her kids to get rid of him. Like, okay, if I bring you back from Tartarus, will you get rid of this situation that we have with your father? Saturn is the only one that decides to take her up on this offer, and he agrees to try to address the situation with Uranus. He returns from Tartarus and castrates his father Uranus, which cast his testicles into the sea. And from the foam of that, Venus is born, which is a story for another day and a whole other workshop, if you ask me. And so because Saturn has castrated his father, he then becomes the king. And he's pretty pleased with himself, and he's sort of ruling for a little while. And he becomes married to Rhea, who also in mythology is his sister, because that's kind of how things worked. And they start to have kids as well. But Saturn hears this rumor that there's a prophecy that one of his kids is going to overpower him. And he's like, I absolutely cannot have that. Like, this is my place. I'm in charge here. And so he decides that in order to prevent any of his children from overthrowing him, the simple thing to do is to eat his children. And then there's not really much that they can do from that situation. So they start to have children, and one by one, Saturn is kind of going through this grotesque children eating process. I'm sure many of you have seen some of the famous paintings of Saturn consuming his babies. And he starts with Pluto. Pluto goes in first, and then the asteroid names are in there too, and one by one, eventually, their last child, Jupiter, or Zeus in mythology, is born, and Rhea is totally sick of this pattern. And so she decides to trick Saturn and give him a stone instead of giving him the baby Jupiter to eat. And she's like, okay, I'm going to hope that he thinks that this stone is his kid as it goes down. And it works, and the stone goes down. And Rhea takes Jupiter into the nether regions and hides him there, where he is able to be raised with love and understanding, and spared the pain and cruelty that Saturn himself went through as a child. Therefore, Jupiter is raised with this kind of inner knowing that he's going to be this great god, because he's raised with all this love and care. And so in a way he does. And when he is ready, he returns home and is able to overthrow his father Saturn. And he gets Saturn to vomit up the stone first, and then all of the children in reverse order. And Jupiter then becomes the patriarch in charge. And so the prophecy comes true that Jupiter has overthrown his father. Intergenerational trauma to the extreme, absolutely. And that's kind of where we're going next, in case you hadn't figured that out for yourself. So in this very old and familiar story, we see a kind of original source of intergenerational trauma. Just because they're gods doesn't mean they're above trauma and, family drama themselves. Like father and like son, we see that the patriarchs in this story are fighting for power, but also just doing the only thing that they know how to do. And I think it's worth mentioning also that when I'm referring to the myth, I'm using gendered pronouns. Saturn and Uranus are both he in the story, but when I'm referring to the planets, I don't use pronouns for the planets because I don't feel that they have gender. And I just want to make that distinction because a lot of traditional astrology is very binary and gendered, and it has been part of my personal practice of working to sort of decolonize or change that framework to de-gender the associations with the planets. So Uranus's qualities of disconnect, vanishing, denial, rupturing, and scapegoating his children are present in this story, so his reign of terror is not disrupted. Meanwhile, Saturn is raised in the absence of light, in a place of cold and dark, through punishment and cruelty, and the absence of care and love, which, as we may know, says a thing or two about Saturn. Therefore, Saturn's solution is to emasculate his father and to take back the power he never had in his own feelings of powerlessness, taking the throne and essentially recreating the whole story itself. So what does it mean for Saturn to be the child of Uranus here? For Saturn to be born into an experience of tyranny and cruelty and oppression? It means that if we're taking the model of epigenetics, Saturn becomes maladapted to normal experiences of warmth, connection, love, and healthy power dynamics. And this gives us quite literally the traditional interpretations of Saturn as a planet that is domiciled in the cold winter signs, as far opposite the summer and domiciles of the luminaries as it can be, representing a planet that is cold, dry, and therefore void of warmth and connection, which are the life force that come from heat and moisture in the temperaments. Again, Uranus doesn't have a traditional interpretation, but modern delineations of the planet as having an erratic, reckless, shocking, unexpected, and potentially scapegoating nature fit pretty well with this myth. In this equation, Saturn is also the faster moving of the two planets, which means it's the one that brings events to a head or initiates between the two. We might also draw a link between this and the way second or third generations of survivors often are the ones to initiate further passages of healing or to bring things to a head, as it can be easier to gain momentum long after the event itself rather than in the immediate wake of something deeply traumatic. And coming back to the notion of disruption with squares and knowing that we have reached a square in this Saturn-Uranus cycle, we look at how Saturn disrupts the cycle of his father's reign and is in turn violently disrupted by Jupiter. Jupiter may be a hero in this story and a benefic in trad astrology, but let's not forget that Jupiter is also repeating the same behavior of domination that has been passed down through generations before him, despite being able to change the course in some ways and thereby offering a sense of hope. And there are plenty of stories in mythology about Zeus or Jupiter that are not so benefic, in my opinion. There are many direct examples of this from this last year that we've been through from 2021, of a sense of disruption that changes the course of events of an otherwise repeating cycle. So just an example of some of these include the revelation of the climate change report that came out last year, the discovery of an additional landmass under the ocean beneath Australia, the unburying of thousands of Indigenous children's bodies in Canada. I don't know if too many of you are in Canada, but it's been quite a process of unburying here in the last year. And of course, the continued disruption and shock of a global pandemic and the radical changes to the status quo of our lives, and the disruption to some of the systemic racism that has been in place for many generations as well. I want to mention also that discussing some of the themes that have been relevant to this square and this disruption is not about reducing the trauma of some of these events, just reducing them to an astrology transit, but rather trying to understand how astrology can provide a healing tool, which is really how I like to work with it in my practice. all of these themes that I've just mentioned are deeply intergenerational in the sense that they're taking place in the present moment, but have a much more powerful effect. Most of their causes have come from prior generations, and the effects will certainly ripple through to generations ahead. So it may be taking place in the present moment, but it's not just about the present moment and the people here itself. So we see that in family systems and in intergenerational trauma, change cannot happen unless we disrupt the order of things. The square, while often considered a source of hardship, is a necessary disruption in an otherwise unending cycle. Things can become unburied and rise to the surface. So how is that closing or waning square notion of a last call present in the climate crisis report? How does it relate to what was seeded in the conjunction back in 1988 when the ecological crisis first became apparent to people? There was this sort of first wake-up call in 88 that what humans were doing was impacting the climate in this detrimental way. And how does the closing square present itself in the continued absence and call to accountability with the genocide of Black and Indigenous people and the wake-up calls from community movements, as well as the call to accountability that happened in Palestine in 2021 as well? How does the waning square present itself in the loss and uncertainty that we are experiencing in the global pandemic? Which also brings us back to the conjunction in the late 80s, when globalization started to make the world a smaller place and more interconnected, where suddenly people were able to impact the lives of others halfway across the world. And what is it that we're suddenly able to really see and address about that now? Something that may have just been starting and getting going in the 80s. In any planetary cycle that we're studying, we can take this look at the current moment and connect it with the larger phase of the cycle that we're in. But we must always remember that it's part of the larger cycle. It's not just a moment divorced in time. And this for me is one of the most profound things about astrology, is to be able to take the moment in time that we're in and see how it relates to these larger themes and larger cycles that we are such small parts of. Anything that has happened in this last year stands in relation to the last conjunction back in 1988. It stands in relation to the opening square in 1999, the opposition in 2009, and potentially to the trines as well, if you're looking at those. So this myth that we've looked at is seeded into the roots of astrology. This story, this intergenerational story about trauma between Uranus and Saturn, is in the roots of astrology, as well as into the dominant culture that we are part of for thousands of years. And if we know anything about astrology, we know that that means it's also been seeded into our personal, family, and social roots as well. And this story has been running in a kind of cycle for thousands of years itself. This means that we have to be willing to acknowledge where that story still lives in us and how we are actors in it, not just where it is done to us or where we're at the effect of it. And in the perspective that planets are gods or deities that act in our world, how do those beings live in us? How are they alive in us in all of their immense power and strength, but also their patriarchal lineage that they come from? As you can see, the story that we told in the beginning, if you remember some of the threads from that, could very well be true. I made up a fictional story, but it might as well be a real story about someone's family experience, and you may even recognize or feel some connection to parts of the story itself. That's because it is a repetition of the same story that has been cycling around for as long as humans have observed the planets cycling around in the sky. Saturn and Uranus could very well be the ancestors of Samuel and Uri from that original story that I told, in the way that they continue to live out those roles. And just to mention, in case you're curious to learn more about the themes of planets as ancestors. I have a friend and colleague, Ari Felix, who's a really wonderful astrologer, and they have a talk about planets as ancestors. That's a really beautiful thing to look at. I think they have it available on their site. So that story was told as a way of understanding how clearly and specifically these ancient myths still live on through our culture as a result of these larger cycles. Whether we consider the source of these cycles to be planetary or human is irrelevant, as they are clearly interconnected. I want to pause to think about Gaia for a minute too, because I've talked a lot about the patriarchs, or the sort of like big daddy energy in these stories. But where do Gaia and Rhea fall in the story as well? Gaia's role in the myth is kind of like this management role. She's managing the anger of divinity while also protecting the safety of her children. So she acts as a kind of medium or intermediary between the realms. So if we think about Gaia as the earth, and that relationship between Gaia as a mythological character and Gaia meaning earth itself and the earth that we live on, does that mean it's the earth's role as our home to manage the anger of divinity or the sort of chaos of the other planets while protecting us and managing the safety of us, her children? Potentially, I believe that the last Saturn-Uranus conjunction in 1988 disrupted this order of things, where Gaia's children began to think that they were at the helm of Gaia herself, or where humans began to feel that they had control over the earth rather than being immersed in the safety of earth as a home, and that there's a confusion about our rightful place in the greater system in which we live. So as we move back now towards the next conjunction, because that's sort of the chapter that lies ahead of us, is the next 10 years or so as we move into the next Saturn-Uranus conjunction in 2032. Maybe it's about finding ways to return to our rightful place and relationship where Gaia or the earth is concerned. So the myth that we talked about is in many ways a story about the patriarchs. But it's actually Gaia that has the power to create them in the first place. And it's Rhea that intervenes and disrupts their cycle of trauma by placing Jupiter in safer pastures and allowing him the possibility of a different outcome in this story. And so I think about this as our care and our capacity to love and nurture, disrupting the harmful aspects of our cycle. Gaia and Rhea are therefore not just women intervening with the patriarchal intervals and story between Saturn and Uranus. They are forces of care and disruption towards healing. So in healing the intergenerational trauma that we all experience in some way, it's about reconnecting with that aspect of ourselves. So it's also about, therefore, reconnection with the earth as Gaia. And as truth continues to become unburied, establishing right responsibility. And again, in the story, obviously Gaia and Rhea are gendered beings, they're women, but I'm thinking about this disruption of care and sense of connection as a kind of force that lives in all of us, regardless of gender. So why do we talk about the stories at all, especially if so many of them are these harmful tales that have been told over and over and over again for thousands of years? Isn't this something that we're potentially trying to move away from? But the reason I'm telling these stories is because they are existing and continue to be relevant cultural myths that we have to challenge and disrupt. If nothing is done, as we can see, the cycles continue and the effects of harm continue to be passed down between the generations. But if something is done, there's an opportunity to change what is passed down, and it starts to look a little different, even if the work is slow and takes generation to generation. So telling this original myth of Saturn and Uranus, for me, needs to be placed in the context of the time in which it began, which is really a context of a colonizing patriarchal time and place on the earth. And if we're going further back than the Hellenistic period, Mesopotamia, where astrology as we understand it now originated, is filled with a long history of dynasties conquering and overthrowing one another. This is the context from which these astrological myths come from. But it's important for us to not reject the myth and the tradition altogether, so that we understand the foundations of where we are now, as well as the roots of our own thinking. And also so we can understand how that myth continues to affect and inform the way that we live now. It's not that the foundation is inherently bad in some way or that we can just kind of bypass it altogether, but that it is our responsibility to understand what is actually woven into it, because we need to be honest about where that still lives in our lives, in our families, in our communities, in our social fabric. This is the same as intergenerational healing. If we sever our curiosity and connection to our personal histories, we also sever our capacity to understand deeply rooted aspects of ourselves, as well as the way that our past might still be informing our current life experience and some of the patterns that are alive there. So what we know about trauma is that it causes us to be trapped in a cycle from the past. While the events of the trauma themselves may become history, we continue to live those events over and over in the present moment. Some of the recent psychological studies that have been done indicate that people often experience as little of 20% of what is actually happening in the present moment. So you might be walking to the store on a Tuesday afternoon, and what's going on in your experience is 80% something else, 20% you walking to the store and going down the street. This other 80% is as if the events of the past are happening in real time for us, like these self-fulfilling prophecies. So here we are in a world where the Saturn-Uranus story is a foundational part of our past, and where the planetary cycle itself will always be part of our lived reality as much as we understand the way the solar system works now. But how much are we able to experience the Saturn-Uranus cycle as it is right now, exactly what it calls us to with total presence? And how much are we experiencing the trauma of this cycle's history, where the dominant patriarchal story becomes 80% of our lived experience of it? We know that the modern day version of this story could very well be real and is not far off from many people's lived experiences. We discussed some of the painful and harmful themes that have happened just within this last year during the waning square that resemble themes from the myth itself. So if you recall, that story I gave in the very beginning might as well be the great, etc. grandsons of Saturn and Uranus, as if it's just one long family line that is continuing to be repeated in modern day. So how well can we be called to the task of disruption and rebuilding that Saturn and Uranus are calling us to now, when we are stuck in the suffering that these planetary energies can often represent in our experience? And again, I want to be clear that it's not about using a kind of like spiritual bypassing or certain notions of manifestation to just sort of like snap out of it. Quite the opposite. I really believe in going deeply into the roots of something in order to change it at its core. And that energy that Gaia and Rhea bring of creativity and of disruption through care needs to be done through going through something rather than around it. And the conversation between traditional and modern practices of astrology, I think, is largely based in a different understanding of fate. And so how does your relationship to fate or your understanding of free will impact your capacity to work with the cycles that are present in our lives right now? Do we have the capacity to use our care and disrupt the harm that is carried over from the past? And is this something that we can do with astrology itself? I want to be clear also that it's not about stopping the cycle itself. We don't ever stop the planetary cycles, like no person has the power to do that. Instead, we participate in care and illuminate where there has been harm. Like all trauma work, it is about deepening our understanding of the hold that the past still has on us. And through this, we have an opportunity to find presence. What we know about healing is that even just a breath, a gaze, or a touch experienced truly as something in the present moment, not that kind of 20-80 split that we often feel, can change so much. Presence affords us some space and breathing room from the powerful cycles of our history, if only for a moment. And I find that the planetary cycles can be both stunning and terrifying in their kind of inevitability, like they just keep going. And so if we're able to even give ourselves like one moment of presence in the midst of that to really see where we are in that cycle, it can be completely altering. So what if part of our journey is not about trying to stop these cycles or to sever our personal and collective histories, families, and stories, but rather about being completely present to them? This means that we have the capacity to find small moments of change and empowerment exactly where we are right now. So we have seen the nature of intergenerational trauma quite clearly today. But this is intergenerational healing that we're talking about now. That ability to be present right here and right now with total acceptance of what is, knowing that we also have this capacity for disruption. This healing echoes just as well and just as far as intergenerational trauma does. So how would this change our experience of the Saturn Uranus square that we're leaving? And how would this change our experience of the last phase of the cycle that we're moving into towards the conjunction over the next 10 years? Here we are at the end of the closing square of this cycle. And if you were alive in 1988, you can think back to what might have been occurring in that conjunction for you. What began at that time? What then got disrupted in 1999 and called into action? What was revealed to you, or what limit did you reach in 2009, 2010? And now here in early 2022, what has surfaced for you that still needs to be resolved? Where is your last call happening? Perhaps there are some family themes that have surfaced for you that are calling you to be present, to see, to pay attention. And perhaps it's not about lived family, but about your culture, your chosen family, your community, the social order that you're part of. So what was disrupted and what must be built in the last stage of the cycle? What needs to be put to rest and categorized in the right way? It is through being present to that very task right here and right now, not as another round of something that you've been through countless times, that presence and healing can be found. And so I'll leave you with this question. What has been unburied for you in this last year that offers you new information that you didn't have in the past? How can you be present to that and any resolution that may be needed in this next decade of your life? How can you use the disruptive energy of this time as a means of care and healing in the final stage of this cycle? And so that brings us to the end of this presentation. This is my email and my website. Oh, ignore this next workshop thing. That's obviously we're past December 19th. My next workshop will probably be in the summer sometime. I'm going to do a Mars retrograde workshop, but there's a way to sign up for my mailing list on my website if that's something that you want to hear about. And I welcome your thoughts, questions, feedback, and comments. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Beautiful work, Erin. This was phenomenal and very, I love the inclusivity and the shift to a more, to a more open understanding of the planets beyond the binary that we've operated in. So thank you. And you're getting a lot of amazing feedback. People were very excited and loved the presentation, as did I. And let's see, we have one question. Have you found that there are repetitive markers in charts of parents and children?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And if you ever want to dive into a little self-study project, it's quite fascinating to put together as many charts as you possibly can for your family. I find, depending on the generation, not everyone has kept track of their birth time. So people likely might know their grandparents' birthday, but not the birth time. But even just if you like set the chart as a noon chart or as an Aries rising chart, it is fascinating to go through the family charts together and see how repeated certain themes are. It's really quite an incredible study. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to do a little self-study project and to go through the charts of their families themselves.
Yeah, it's incredibly fascinating to see the patterns there, and also with celebrity families and seeing how they connect. I also did one with the Nazis and the Hitler regime, like the little quote unquote family he had, and that was also illuminating.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes it can be helpful also to look at celebrity families because we're a little more emotionally divorced sometimes than
Right.
if it's our family. Sometimes it's harder to see things in our own charts and our family charts, but it's a great way to do it too.
Yeah. We have another question. Is it necessary to follow the father's line?
Oh, no, I would really encourage you to look at both of the lines in your family, or, maybe you have a family where there are a few lines where there weren't just two traditional parents that you lived with. In the reason that it's so focused on the sort of patrilineal side in this lecture is because the Saturn Uranus story is about the patriarchs. So it was very focused on that sort of father to son passed down relationship, because the myth of Saturn and Uranus and this planetary cycle that we're looking at primarily involves the men. And that's also why I felt that it was really relevant and important to sort of bring in the women in that story more as well, because they actually play these really crucial roles, but don't themselves have the same like large cultural associations with them.
Right. Yeah, it's so true. We had a comment earlier that someone appreciated. Let's see, where was it? I will scroll. They said, looking at Gaia, they loved the inclusion of the goddesses and the feminine aspect in what is so heavily masculine. Is there some way that maybe Rhea watches over realms that are traditionally viewed as evil or of bad spirit? Those areas contained in the 6th, 12th axis of houses need to be fully integrated to move past and transmute difficult, dark things. I don't know if that was a question, but it was a good comment of appreciation. And do you have any insight into that?
I think it's a really interesting reflection, because for me, there's a really obvious connection in this myth between Saturn being banished to this place of no return, like outside of light and warmth, and Saturn's joy in the 12th house, which is essentially like considered to be a house of banishment from some perspectives in astrology. So again, you can see how directly Saturn's place in that myth correlates with Saturnian themes in astrology. But it's an interesting thing to consider, like whether there are also guardians of the 12th and different forces and beings and deities and presences that can be worked with to sort of support 12th house experiences as well.
Right. Yeah, that's so important, because I think that house often gets, put into the darkness. Figuratively and literally, I guess, in that sense. So we have 4 minutes, and I'm wondering, we don't have more questions come up, and I'm wondering if we could just chat a little bit again about your consultation services and what you offer. You mentioned another presentation in your newsletter, and is that the best way for people to, one, contact you? Is that through the website? And then two, should they sign up for your newsletter to just be on top of all of your presentations? And how does that, yeah, I just want to make sure everyone is aware of what you offer.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm always a little shy about saying too much about that part. So thank you. Yeah, my website, erinfogel.com, will have a little more information about the different offerings that I do, but astrology is one of 3 modalities that I work with. And I do see clients 9 to 5. So if you are interested in having a reading with me, that's something that I happily set up with you. I use online booking software, so it's really easy. I also practice tarot, as well as a modality called core pattern readings, which essentially people's repetitive life patterns that they experience and what is at the root of those patterns. So those are the different things that I'm offering right now, but I do regular workshops as well. And most of my workshops are also pay what you can. And I work a lot with my friend, teacher, colleague, mentor, Julie Simmons, who is an incredible Toronto astrologer, if you don't know her. And so we often do a lot of our workshops together online. So you can tune in from other places in the world. And yeah, my newsletter, I usually send out once a month on the new moons. I call it moon mail.
Ooh,
And
love it.
so I would never flood someone's inbox. It's usually a once a month thing with some reflections for the new moon, as well as like any workshops that are coming up or anything like that.
Yeah, that seems very important for people to get. And I love that you mentioned, it's just one time a month, and people get so many emails.
Yeah.
So the important one can get through.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I find your work fascinating. Oh, the other thing is, do you work with, like, if someone wanted to bring to you their family and from like a few people in their family and talk about a certain pattern, is that something you do as well?
Absolutely. I'm pretty flexible with like what I do in a session with people. I know that some astrologers are more structured about like, okay, there's this kind of reading, there's this kind of reading. One, I'm just kind of like, are you coming for astrology, tarot, or core pattern reading? And whatever we do with that time is completely up to the client. And so if people are curious to look at a family system with an astrologer, then that is absolutely something that I would love to do with people, by all means.
Great. This has been wonderful, and we're so happy to have you and look forward to continued relationships here. So thank you for showing up and teaching us about this important collective aspect.
Thank you so much for having me. I have been a huge fan of Kepler College for a long time, so it's really an honor to be here, and I really appreciate everyone listening and engaging and taking in the information. So thank you very much.